My name is Sandy Wezowicz. This is part 2 of a presentation I've been invited to present through CCFI. I am part of a global ministry as the Israel Education Director, and it's my privilege to be able to present part 2 of a teaching that was intended to give an understanding of Israel, past and present, from the time of Abraham right through to the current situation and all of the current events that are happening as I speak in Israel. So welcome, and I hope you will find this important and informative and accurate. In the 1880s, it was a time of great significance in the modern state of the Jewish state of Israel, in the land and for the people. And it was, as I mentioned in part 1, it was a time of a birth of a movement called the Aliyah movement, going up, ascending, because we know Jerusalem is on a hill, surrounded by hills. And so to go up to Jerusalem, they called it making Aliyah. And so it was the birth of that movement of Jews because of the global persecution, cyclical persecution, particularly in Russia and parts of Europe. The Jews began to look to their ancient homeland. Many of them, most, as a matter of fact, were secular Jews. And you wonder, did they even understand that they were part of a prophecy that God had promised through countless prophets in the Old Testament, that one day he would bring the people back to the land and make the cities once again thrive, the land thrive, and to be productive. And so that movement then that was caused by increased global persecution began the Jews moving back to the land. And they began, it was called Palestine at that time. It was the name for the general area, and it was still under the Ottoman Turks. And they were purchasing land in small parcels from the landowners that were Arab landowners that were living in Damascus, and they were selling what they thought they had a great deal going, selling this swamp mosquito-infested land that was unproductive, selling it to these Jews coming in, and so at inflated prices. And you know, at that time, I've heard the stories on how every Jewish household around the world had a little box on their kitchen table where they would drop their little coins in. And when that box was full, they would then send it. And so all that money that was coming in the little bits and pieces that would accumulate, and it would be enough to buy another parcel of land. And so they then began to move back, and they made the miracle of Israel, making unproductive, swamp-infested land that would eventually become agricultural miracle in Israel. And with that came peoples from the other parts of the Ottoman Empire that we now know where Israel is, where that is where they settled, but it was not yet a nation. So the peoples that were living in desperate times in the Ottoman Empire began to filter back because the land was productive, and when you have productive land, what do you have? You have store owners. You have people who need to take the produce to market. You have all the ancillary then activity that surrounds land becoming productive. So we talked earlier about how you had Arab peoples, you had Druze, you had people coming from Africa, people coming from other parts of even of Asia. As the land prospered, they began to move back as well. So that was the Aliyah movement. And then we mentioned about how the Hebrew language was resurrected so that the people who could come, who would be speaking every language of their own country, would be able to come, learn a language, and bring a unity of heart and purpose to the people and identity. Identity is so important. So you had not only the Aliyah movement, not only did you have the rebirth of the language, but also we ended the last session with the Zionist movement that was birthed in a situation that had happened in France, and that the newspaper reporter, Theodor Herzl, as he reported this story, and an understanding, an epiphany came. The Jews would never ultimately be safe in any part of the world. They needed their own homeland. And so he began a movement. And it was a movement of the Jews coming back, a Zionist movement. So now as the Jewish Zionists were looking to Palestine, at that time, now much of the world was in turmoil. World War I broke out. And it was a 4-year war that literally, practically exhausted the British Empire. You know, they thought that they could enter this war and that it would be, they would be victorious quickly. It was against Germany and Austria and Hungary and against the Ottoman Turks. And so they thought that it would be quickly over. Well, it wasn't. And so it left the British financially in dire circumstances. And an appeal went out for financial help. And for Jews around the world began to finance the war. That was very significant. The second thing that happened is there was a Jewish scientist named Faisal-Weizmann. He was living in Great Britain, and he had developed the formula to produce acetone, which was used in explosives. And so what he did was he gave that to the British. And it literally changed the balance in the area of armaments for the British at a key significant time. So you had the Jewish financing, helping to finance the war. You had a Jewish scientist providing this much-needed, miraculous production that was so necessary in explosives. And it became obvious to the British and to the Americans and to those that were involved in the fighting that the Ottoman Empire would eventually fall. And it would leave, as it broke up, it would mean that over 2 million square miles would be now really literally free to be redispersed. And so when the Ottoman Empire fell, so did the Islamic rule over that part of the world. And at this time, during the wartime, during these 4 years, as the war was coming to a close and it was assuring victory for the Allies, at that same time, the Prime Minister of England and his cabinet were primarily evangelical Christians. And as evangelical Christians, these believers really believed, ultimately, in the Jewish people returning back to the land. They had an understanding of the timing and the season of God, and that God had indeed made that irrevocable covenant that he made with Abraham and to his descendants. And they understood that. They had a revelation of that. And so they understood that with the fall of the British Empire, they were committed to be the instruments to bring about a Jewish state. And so with that recognition, they signed what was called the Balfour Declaration. It was authored by the British Foreign Secretary, whose name was Arthur Balfour, who was a devoted and committed Christian, who, again, was one of those who absolutely believed in the rights of the Jews to a Jewish homeland within those 2 million square miles. And so the Balfour Declaration he signed on behalf of the government of Great Britain read, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national homeland for the Jewish people. And Arab leaders, which is interesting, and this is a little known fact that too many people and historians ignore. But Arab leaders, led by Emir Faisal, who he was one of the leaders of, remember I mentioned that in that time, we're talking about tribal leaders. But Emir Faisal was a man who was recognized as an authority or having the right to speak for so many of the Arab peoples there. He initially endorsed the Balfour Plan, hoping that not only would a Jewish homeland be carved out of that, but also believing that so too would independence come to Arab peoples, and that they would then be able to carve out of that large Ottoman Empire for their own peoples. And as Jewish immigration continued and as more land was sold by those absentee landowners, and as independence was initially denied the Arabs after the end of World War II, unrest began to settle within the Arab peoples. And they began to have riots in that part of the world against the Jews. And today the Palestinians teach their own perspective, by the way, on the Balfour Declaration. They don't see it as a blessing to Israel and a promise to Israel, the Jewish people, that they would have an independent Jewish state. This is how they describe it. They describe it as the crime of the century. And quote, the most inhumane terrorist crime, creating a Zionist illegal state. That was the official position of the Fatah political party, the major political party in the in Palestine, or in the West Bank area, and they made that public in 2017. So a Faisal-Weizmann agreement then between Jews and Arabs was actually signed in 1919, right after the war, and it was during the Paris Peace Conference. The Jews were represented by Dr. Chaim Weizmann, and the Arabs, and he, by the way, was at that time was made president of the Zionist organization, because as you remember, I said that Herzl began an organization. And so he became its president. And he then was representing the Jewish perspective, and the voice of the Arabs was Emir Faisal. And he was the son of a Sharif Hussein, and he was a commander-in-chief of the Arab armies that fought against the Ottoman Turks. And so they came into an agreement, and he signed the agreement. Faisal signed the agreement as a representative for all of the Arabs. And both of them, both Chaim Weizmann and Emir Faisal, both of them wished to set up their own nations in the land that would be the Ottoman Empire, now would be 2 million square miles to be determined. And so both Faisal and his father, by the way, believed that Zionism would bring financial resources and technical expertise into Palestine, and that they, the Jews, would help to transform the economic circumstances of the Arabs in both Palestine and beyond. And remember, in the first session I talked about how as the land became alive and as Arabs were moving in to be able to take part in this economic thriving of the land, that both these leaders saw now, with all of that land available, that it could be for both. And so when they signed the agreement, when an agreement was signed in 1919 at the Paris Conference at the end of World War I, Emir Faisal declared, and I'm quoting, "We Arabs look with the deepest sympathy on the Zionist movement. We will wish the Jews a most hearty welcome home. I look forward, and my people with me look forward to a future in which we will help you and you will help us, so that the countries in which we are mutually interested may once again take their places in the community of the civilized peoples of the world." A strong statement by this Arab leader. Now, what happened is with the agreement, the peace agreement that was signed, Emir Faisal's family were given 3 kingdoms. They were given 3 parcels of land, and out of that would come Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. Once Faisal and his family received their 3 carved out kingdoms to create those new countries, and by the way, I would imagine most of you that are hearing this are surprised. You probably thought those nations existed for centuries. No, they were carved out of the Ottoman Empire, just as eventually so would Israel. But as that carved out land would be given to Faisal, what happened is he suddenly, there was no need now to be able to stand with the Jewish people. And so he betrayed the Weizmann-Faisal agreement, and he said, quote, realized that a Jewish state would not be practical. So in 1920, in San Remo, Italy, representatives of the Allied powers who were victorious in World War I met together to decide the final future of what would be the Middle East. And 4 months later, the international peace negotiators incorporated what they agreed, but they also incorporated the Balfour Declaration into their deliberations and came into agreement that they would agree exactly what the Balfour Declaration said, the creation of a Jewish homeland. And eventually, what they agreed it's in San Remo was adopted by all the members of the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations, the United Nations did not exist at this time. The League of Nations, there were 51 nations in the League of Nations, and they all agreed to the agreements of the parceling out of the land and also included the Balfour Declaration. Now, the U.S., we weren't part of the League of Nations, by the way, but our own Congress voted, recognizing the Balfour Declaration and Great Britain's responsibility to carry it out. However, what was agreed upon would not happen, and it was quickly fading away. So out of that land then, this is what gained. We said Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. All of those nations were created out of the Ottoman Empire. In 1922, Great Britain yielded to Arab pressure, and what was left of Palestine, they cut out 77% of it, what was remaining. They had given it to the Hashemites, but also they did something else, because you see what happened. The government in Great Britain, that those evangelical leaders, after the war, they were not voted in office, and instead there was a change in government, and no longer was that government in a place of heart to support a Jewish state. They were now more interested in maintaining the Arab oil. And so we're going to see a shift in a government position, how they viewed a potential Jewish state. Instead, what they did was they forbade, not only were those countries carved out of the Ottoman Empire, but also they forbade the Jews from settling east of the Jordan River. In other words, if you look at the map of Israel, and you'll see where the Jordan River is, the Jordan River runs north to south, and they said the Jews could only settle in the western part, but they said Arabs could settle anywhere. See, what was happening is there was beginning to come a containment, so that the Jews were even forbidden from buying any land. Then only what they had, and only restricted of what in the future could be. And then in 1923, Great Britain gave the Golan Heights. Now, if you've ever been to Israel, everyone knows this principle. Whoever has the high ground controls. And so the Golan Heights, when you go to Israel, you see the Golan Heights. It's the high place. And so now Great Britain gave the strategic Golan Heights, they gave it over to the French Mandate, and the French, who were part of that, the Allies, they gave it, and they eventually made it part of Syria. Syria would become enemies of Israel, so they would maintain the high ground. The Jews still did not have a nation. they still were seeing what was promised to them shrinking, shrinking, shrinking. Great Britain would not honor the Balfour Declaration, and instead they yielded to that Arab pressure. And they said things like Israel, the Jews weren't ready to be a country. And they kept stalling out. And unrest in the land festered as there were Arab riots. There was a man who would come out of that Arab community, Haj Amin al-Husseini. He was a man who hated the Jews. And we will see that in the 1930s, as everything was brewing in Europe, the rise of Hitler, he was a friend of Hitler. And he eventually, there are pictures of he and Hitler together, and the idea was that he would give, and those Arabs under his sort of influence would side with Nazi Germany. And when Nazi Germany would cleanse Europe of all the Jews, then they would turn to the Middle East and clear out the Jews. And so you had Haj Amin al-Husseini. He led virulent anti-Semitic riots against the Jews, and in the 1920s and the 1930s, there was a horrific slaughtering of Jews in the city of Hebron, and there was so much unrest, and it would continue. It would continue on past World War II. And in response to his influence in 1939, again, Great Britain wanted to satisfy the Arab influence. They actually signed a paper in 1939. Now, we're talking about right on the cusp of World War II. They signed an agreement, and what the agreement was this. It said that only 75,000 Jews could leave and immigrate to Palestine in 5 years. Now, we are seeing the persecution of the Jews in Europe. We're beginning to see what is going to become the concentration camps and the slaughtering of 6 million Jews. And at the time when they are trying to escape and come to a place of safety, many of them looking to Palestine, to that area that was set aside by the Allied powers as a place for the Jews, they were trying to leave, and instead what happened is Great Britain signed this paper in agreement with the Arab Palestinians that they would only allow 15,000 Jews each year, and then after that they would close the border. This in a time when Jews were trying to survive and escape what would be the horrific Holocaust. And at the end of World War II, we would hear the awful story of 6 million Jews that would be massacred from Europe and from Russia. And not only that, but 5,000 Jewish communities would be obliterated, and literally would be obliterated from the map. With the end of World War II and with the horrific Holocaust that would come to light, it brought a change in world opinion. Germany was defeated. It exposed the horrors of the concentration camps, of the ovens. And people then became so much more aware of the necessity and the right of the Jewish people for a homeland in their ancient homeland that had been agreed back so many years before, after World War I. And so great pressure was upon Great Britain to honor the Balfour Declaration. And on November 30th, 1947, the United Nations took a vote. And the vote was to partition what remained of Palestine into two roughly equal sections. So you had all of those nations carved out of the Ottoman Empire. What was left, they said in 1947, the UN, and there's much history in that I don't have time to go into, but they finally voted, okay, we're going to take what remains And now we're going to divide it into an Arab state, and we're going to divide it into a Jewish state. And so they took a vote, and it was passed. And the truth is that in the area that they divided, Israel would get a little more land, but it was uninhabited. It would be desert for the greatest portion. And they agreed in this that Jerusalem would belong to neither. It would be an international city, but it would be surrounded by Arabs. That would be part of the Arab state. So that was the UN vote, established two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. Well, the Jews agreed, and they accepted it, even though it meant that the land that they would be given at one point would be so narrow, it would just be just miles in a little strip of land from the north and the south, and it would leave them vulnerable. But as David Ben-Gurion, who was really the leader of the Zionist movement and would become this first prime minister of Israel, said, some land is better than no land. And so the Jewish leadership agreed, and the Arabs would not. So had the Palestinian Arabs agreed to that, a division of the land, today they would be celebrating, just like Israel, 75 years of statehood, but they voted no. And so on December 1947, this is a little fact that's not known by many, 5 months before Israel would declare a nation in 1948, they would declare a nation in 1948 they did that the day that the British would finally leave Palestine, and then Israel would declare statehood. But 5 months before that happened, the wealthy Arab, there were 150,000 Arab merchants and business people, educators, and families left to wait out the storm because they knew what was going to happen. They knew that the day the British pulled out and Israel would declare itself a nation, that there would be Arab armies who would come in and totally wipe out Israel. So these wealthy people, educated people said, well, we'll just 5 months, we'll leave temporarily and we'll make it, easier, and then we're going to come back because, of course, there's no way these Jews are going to survive because they're going to be facing 5 Arab armies. So 1,878 years after destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, Isaiah's prophecy is fulfilled in the establishment of the state of Israel. He said, once again, God will choose Israel and will settle them in their own land. They'll make captives of their captors and rule over their oppressors. On the day the Lord gives you relief from the suffering and turmoil and cruel bondage. And so on May 14th, 1948, the nation of Israel, the state of Israel, was officially created. And God had used the horrors of Nazi Germany, the horrific destruction of much of Europe. God used all of that to birth the land of Israel. And so one day, Israel became a nation. The very next day, May 15th, 24 hours later, Israel faced 5 Arab armies. Now look, this is a nation who's just been birthed. There were 675,000 Jews living there. They faced 50 million Arabs. No one expected them to live. No one. As a matter of fact, President Truman was president at the time, and my husband and I toured the Truman Museum. And we actually saw a paper where the United States was the first country to recognize the state of Israel. But it is said of Harry Truman, truly, in his papers, that he did it, but he did not believe that Israel would survive. But God. God is a miracle-working God. No one, when God says something, no man, no army, nothing will stand against what God has proclaimed. So hundreds of thousands of Arabs fled. Now, when the nation was formed, publicly, the new prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, encouraged the Arabs not to flee. He said, don't flee, because remember, these were not religious Jews. And they said, we can build a nation together. We can become citizens together. We can build something great here. But instead, hundreds of thousands of Arabs were believing what the Arab governments were declaring, and their military. They were saying, look, just leave for 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, you can come back, because we're going to push every Jew into the Mediterranean. And then you can come back and not only reclaim your home, your business, but now you can share in the spoils. I mean, look what the Jews have done with the land, and we'll divvy it up. So you not only will have what you left, but you'll have more. So what happened is thousands and thousands left, believing that Israel would be defeated. But God, Israel was not defeated. And so the War of Independence broke out. Israel established itself as a nation. Israel did not lose. Israel became a nation, and Israel even gained land. In the ceasefire that followed from that War of Independence, Jordan annexed Judea and Samaria, by the way, and they renamed it the West Bank. And we hear about the West Bank today. It was under the Jordanians after that war. And it extends all the way to Jerusalem, by the way. And Egypt annexed the Gaza Strip. And today we hear so much about the Gaza Strip, and plus the whole Sinai Peninsula, which is the southern part. It's the desert area. And so Egypt took that. But those nations refused. Here's the thing. What do you do with all those Arabs who fled temporarily? Now, I want to tell you that there were Arabs, innocent Arabs, who were killed because it's war. And those Arab villages that were in the line sort of fire. Now, remember, Israel did not declare war on the Arabs. This is so important. The Arabs declared war on Israel. Israel had a right to defend itself. There were innocent Arabs who were killed. There were innocent Arabs who lost their homes, who lost their fields, who lost their vineyards. That is true. But a majority of the Arabs fled thinking it was temporary. Now the war is over. Israel is not lost. You would think that those countries would absorb then those Arabs who fled temporarily, because at the same time there were thousands and thousands of Jews who had lived all over the Middle East for centuries. Remember, they had been dispersed back, 1,800 years before. They were established in countries. What happened is when that war broke out, Israel won. Guess what? All of those people had to flee. All those Jews were no longer welcome. And so they had to flee. Where are they going to go? They're going to go to Israel, to the new state. Israel had to absorb thousands and thousands of Jews who could flee with nothing but what they could carry on them. On the other hand, the Arabs who fled temporarily, thinking that it would only be a couple of weeks, they were not absorbed by their Arab brothers. Instead, they were placed in refugee camps. And they would be used as a pawn for the world. And instead, all of those Arabs could have become citizens. And the sad thing of it is had they accepted that UN Resolution 181 that divided up the land into 2 states, had those Arabs accepted it, they would have had their own state. But instead, because the Arab nations made war, those same Arab peoples were now in that land, but not a state. Do you understand? It's just, now they were living in the land that they had been promised by the UN to be their own nation. But they weren't even made a new nation because now Jordan took that land. But they did not absorb the people, and so they kept them in refugee camps. So you're going to see the descendants of those camps that would be in Lebanon and would be in Jordan and even some in Egypt. And they kept them, and that was the beginning of the refugee problem that we're still hearing about today in the news in Gaza. The problem was now they weren't citizens of anybody, and they were there. And it's so amazing when you think of decisions that were made by people that instead of reasoning it out and hearing a prime minister promising to build a nation together, they lost. They lost. After the war in 1949, the UN created a separate agency. This is so important that you understand this. Those Arabs who were now refugees, now again, I want to make it clear, Israel absorbed all those Jews who were fleeing those Middle Eastern countries. They never asked for any help from the international community. Now, this is a new nation. We're talking about absorbing thousands upon thousands of people who were coming needy. They could only take what they could immediately carry. And suddenly this new nation that has to set up a government, has to set up all the social services, all the education, all the housing. Now suddenly thousands are coming in, and Israel took care of it. On the other hand, what happened is the Arab nations did not. They gave no financial help at all. And so the United Nations created a separate agency that was supposed to aid just one people, and that was the refugees who fled. Okay? And it's called the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. It was established in 1949. And think about it. It was to help them reestablish themselves. And here we are in 2014. And now that agency has swelled to tens of thousands of employees with millions and billions of dollars flooding into Palestinian areas. And still we have these refugee camps set up. And we're now seeing fifth generation of these Palestinian refugees who still have refugee status, even if they don't live in those areas. But they can carry the title of refugee. Today, it bankrolls, that United Nations is called UNRWA, bankrolls 5 million Arabs, has over 30,000 employees. Many of them are part of Hamas. That's what has come out in the recent months of the horrors out of Gaza, that so many of these UNRWA workers are part of Hamas. And it has a budget over $1 billion a year. Yet 81.3% of the people just in Gaza are living under the national poverty line. And it brings up the question, where's the money? Where's the money gone? Well, we know where the money's gone. One of the UNRWA's core values is educating Palestinian children in their UNRWA schools. And we've been hearing a little bit more about this these last few months. That they teach in those schools. And I have seen many, many, many reports on it. I have seen videos of it that were even produced by Arabs themselves, that in those schools they believe, because remember, many of them their teachers are Palestinian Arabs, and they teach in these schools the belief that one day through war they will destroy Israel and take back their land. Many of them don't even have Israel on a map. They name all the cities in Israel by an Arab name. No Arab country would be satisfied with even a fraction of 1%. Listen to that, 1% of the Middle East for Jews, less than 1%. Israel. Israel's the size of New Jersey. When you look at the map of the Middle East, it's shocking how tiny Israel is in comparison to the Arab nations. In 1967, and so what happens in Israel is a continuation of war upon war upon war. I'll be just finishing this, but just giving you some idea. There are a couple of things that would happen that would change the strategic influence and impact on Israel in the world. In 1967, war broke out with Egypt, and it became known as the Six-Day War. Well, in that war, Israel destroyed the Egyptian Air Force, literally destroyed it within a couple of hours. It pushed back Syria out of the Golan Heights. Remember, I said the strategic value of the Golan Heights, that if you have the high point, you have control. Well, Israel pushed at that same time, 6 days, they pushed Syria out of the Golan Heights, and then they held the strategic ground. They also took over the Sinai Peninsula and Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. Eventually, by the way, in 1979, Egypt and Israel would sign a peace treaty. And so today, Egypt is at peace with Egypt as well as Jordan. But on the last day of the war, the Jordanians had been warned by Israel, don't get involved in this war. But the truth is, they began to believe the propaganda coming out of Egypt, that Egypt was about to enter Jerusalem, and they were about to, they were winning these tank battles, they were gaining ground, and the Jordanians believed, instead of believing the Israelis saying, don't enter the war. We've learned to accommodate. Remember, they controlled Jerusalem, the Jordanians did. They held the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. And so the Jewish leadership said to them, don't make war with us. Don't declare war with us. We've learned to accommodate. We've learned together. Don't enter. Well, they believed the Egyptian propaganda. They declared war, and it was a big mistake for Jordan. And on that day, they lost Jerusalem, and they lost all of the land in the West Bank. Judea and Samaria now became part of Israel. So for the first time since 606 BC, Israel was once again the capital of an independent Israel. And just as the ancient prophets had spoken. But in the late 70s, there was much pressure on Israel to give land for peace, and we would see that over and over again. Lasting peace would not come to Israel. By the late 70s, many peace initiatives would coming to Israel, and a lot of it was pressure from the United States to give land for peace as a sign of, is a good peace sign that you had goodwill, and therefore that the Palestinian leadership would enter into negotiations, and there could bring peace, and there could be two states, there could be an Arab state, and everything would be quiet in that part of the world. Well, it didn't happen. And since 1948 to the present, there's been 9 conflicts, 2 intifadas, which is a war of terrorism, and now 1 full-scale war against Israel. In 1993, in Oslo, Norway, the leaders of Israel, the Palestinians, again under Arafat and President Clinton, signed the Oslo Accords, and it recognized the PLO as a legitimate representative of all the Arab Palestinians. It said, we're willing to give municipal authority over you Palestinian leaders. We will, we will allow you to set some balance and stability in the Palestinian areas that would lead ultimately to a Palestinian state. Well, Israel, the only thing they asked of the Palestinians is that they would dismantle their terrorist organizations and acknowledge Israel's right to exist. So they agreed to the Oslo Accords. Israel kept their promise. The Palestinians did not. And interesting enough, 6 months later, the Palestinian leader, Abbas, said this. He was speaking to an Arab audience, and he reminded them of a time when Muhammad had deceived the Meccans by declaring a peace treaty and then turning around and slaughtering them because he never intended to keep it. And so he was bragging and saying, we did the same thing. In 2000, and I want to highlight a couple things before we end. In the year 2000, again, there were incredible peace talks at Camp David. And President, the Prime Minister Ehud Barak, the Palestinian President Yasser Arafat met with President Bill Clinton for peace talks, and in those peace talks were offered the most unprecedented deal to the Palestinians had they accepted, as some military leaders say with chagrin. Had Israel agreed to it, it would have led to their destruction. Because what they were offering is the Arabs would have 96% of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. They would have sovereignty over East Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, the holiest place for Jews. 50,000 Arab Palestinian refugees would be allowed to return back in. The $30 billion would be given in compensation to rebuild an infrastructure of the new Palestinian state. And here's what happened. Yasser Arafat turned it down. And 2 months later, violence broke out in Jerusalem over the Temple Mount, and it led to an undeclared low-grade war where Jews were being bombed on buses. They were being slaughtered. They were being murdered. And had Yasser Arafat and the Arabs agreed, they could have had another opportunity for a Palestinian state. Again, in 2005, again, world pressure came to Israel, and they said, look, you have people living in the Gaza Strip. At that time, there were no borders between Gaza and Israel. There was an exchange of populations. I actually met with some Jewish people who said, we used to love going into Gaza, on Shabbat, because their business, we loved their restaurants, and we'd shop there. And they said, but what happened is in 2005, there was an election, and guess what? Gaza voted in Hamas. And from that period of time on, we see what happened. 3,000 greenhouses that had been built by Jewish financiers to help bring stability to Gaza, those were all turned over to Hamas. The houses that the Jews had built, as a matter of fact, you may remember, some of you, the film of the military, the IDF, Israel had to go in and literally force the Jews living there out. They left their homes, their schools, the playgrounds, all that they had built, and they wouldn't leave. And so the IDF went in, and they had to literally drag the Jews out. Turned over Gaza. The whole thing would be, all those greenhouses that where they employ Arabs, that will give them a good solid foundation to build stability in Gaza. What happened? When Hamas was voted in right away, those greenhouses, they were allowed to be looted. They never went back to work. All the plants, everything died out. Homes were destroyed. And so it literally turned into what we're seeing today. It laid the groundwork where those horrible tunnels were built and financed by millions and ultimately billions of dollars. So I just want to say I can give more examples of opportunities where, again, Israel has put out the hand of peace, and it seems like the Arabs are about to enter in. But again, time and time again, in 2008 at Annapolis talks, they broke down again. And at that time, the Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, never showed up to complete them. So we need to understand that today, because you see, it's not about with the Palestinian Arabs. And I don't care how peaceful many of them are. Ultimately, those and it's a majority of them that are representing their voice, even up in the West Bank areas, that it isn't that they want and satisfied with a two-state solution. They could have had it 3 different times. But ultimately what it is, and Hamas has made it very clear, they don't want a part of the land. They want all of the land. And so we as believers need to stand for what God said about the land. This is not just a piece of property that can change hands to anyone who wants it. This is land that has been consecrated. This is a land that God spoke to Abraham about, who drew boundaries about, and that God still has a plan. He still has a call. He still has a purpose for Israel, for the people, for the land, and for that city of Jerusalem. God is not a God that will lie, and we will see the day, if we live long enough, to see everything that God ever spoke over the land and the people to come to pass. Amen.